Claire Wallace knew how to keep a straight face. It wasn't a learned skill. It was a character trait forged over years of working in the financial control department of a large trading company, where numbers don't lie, but people constantly do. At 30, she had short, dark hair and gray eyes with a particular coolness that could be mistaken for indifference until you faced it in a serious conversation. Then it became clear. This wasn't indifference. It was the patience of a person who knows how to wait for the right moment. She had worked with spreadsheets and reports for 5 years straight, could spot an error in a multi-page document in 15 minutes, and never raised her voice in meetings, even when colleagues were spouting utter nonsense. Management valued her for her cool head. Her husband, it seemed, did too, although lately Claire had noticed that he had replaced the word value with use. He just hadn't admitted it out loud yet. They had been married for 7 years. The first 3 were good, then they coasted on inertia. Then the inertia began to fade, but Claire convinced herself it was just a rough patch. Ethan's business wasn't going as well as he'd hoped. He was stressed. It would pass. She was good at explaining away others' weaknesses with circumstances. This, too, was part of her character, and perhaps its most vulnerable part. Ethan Wallace was 7 years older than his wife. He owned a small chain of home goods stores, 4 locations in different parts of the city, a warehouse on the outskirts, 2 hired managers, and a dozen sales associates. Outwardly, he projected confidence. He wore good suits, had a habit of speaking about plans as if they were already accomplished facts, and knew how to enter any room as if he already owned it. It worked on most people. Claire knew the other side, the late-night talks about loans, the grim silence after calls from the bank, the irritation he hid behind a veil of fatigue. But knowing isn't the same as fully understanding. Tuesday morning began with a text from her mother. Helen had written the night before. "Honey, your father and I have decided to come for a few days. We miss you. Dad says he hasn't been in the city for a long time and wants to walk around his old haunts." Claire reread the message twice, put her phone on the charger, and stared at the bedroom ceiling for a long time. She had been sleeping alone for several nights now. Ethan was on a business trip. Her parents didn't visit often. After her father's retirement, they sold their apartment, moved down to Florida, and bought a small house on the Gulf Coast, just as they had dreamed their whole lives. Her father disliked the hassle of long trips. Her mother disliked being a burden. If they decided to come, it meant they truly missed her. Or maybe they sensed something. Helen possessed that strange maternal intuition that works across distances and silence. Claire had never complained to her parents about her relationship with Ethan, not once in 7 years. It wasn't out of pride, but conviction. Family matters are private to be kept within the home. Now she thought that conviction had cost her dearly. Ethan had left for his business trip with a large suitcase and a business-like demeanor. Suppliers in the next state, he'd said, negotiating a new shipment. Could be 3 days, could be a week. He kissed her on the cheek quickly, habitually, like touching a doorknob before leaving, and left in a cab. Claire watched from the window as the yellow car disappeared around the corner. She felt nothing in particular. That in itself should have been a warning sign, but she was used to attributing her lack of feeling to fatigue. She texted her mother that she would pick them up herself. The flight was scheduled to land at 6:40 p.m. She left early, allowing extra time for traffic and parking. The airport at that hour was alive, noisy, smelling of coffee from the cafes near the entrance, and something vaguely unsettling, like all places where people say goodbye and greet each other at the same time. Claire grabbed a coffee to go and stood by the glass doors of the arrivals area to wait. The board showed the flight had landed. Passengers would start coming out in about 20 minutes. For the first few minutes, she watched the stream of people with suitcases, tired faces, joyful embraces, children being lifted into the air, elderly couples walking slowly and silently because they needed no words. She scanned the crowd for her mother, a small, neatly dressed woman in beige, and her father, tall and straight-backed, with the distinct walk of a former public servant that doesn't fade even in retirement. But they weren't the first people she saw. First, a familiar line of the shoulders, then a characteristic turn of the head, then the face. Ethan was standing near the edge of the arrivals hall, slightly away from its main flow of people where it was less crowded. He wasn't looking around. He was looking at a young woman beside him, blonde in a short leather jacket, with a duffel bag over her shoulder. She was tall, striking with the kind of confident posture that is either natural or comes from the constant feeling of being watched and enjoying it. Claire didn't know her, had never seen her before, but one glance was enough to understand this woman was not a colleague or a business partner. The woman was saying something to him and laughing. Ethan leaned toward her and took the bag from her hand gently. The way you take something from someone you want to please. And then he kissed her. Not on the cheek, but on the lips, briefly, but without the slightest bit of caution, the way you kiss someone you love. Claire didn't move. The coffee in her hand remained untouched. She stood and watched as her husband, who was supposedly negotiating with suppliers in another state, took an unknown woman's hand and led her toward the exit. They walked side by side, shoulder to shoulder, and their movements had a particular synchronicity that doesn't develop overnight. It was the way people walk when they are long accustomed to being together. He was carrying her bag. It was a small thing, but that small detail hit harder than anything else because he hadn't carried a bag for Claire or anything else for a long time. Something inside her chest shifted. Not with pain at first, but with a dull, almost physical jolt, as if the floor had swayed beneath her feet and then settled back, but something in her equilibrium had changed forever. Claire took a step forward, and at that moment a heavy, warm hand rested on her shoulder. "Claire," her father's voice said, calm, low, without a single extraneous note. She turned around. Robert Peterson was standing beside her, a man of 65 with a straight back and a face that over decades of public service had developed an imperturbability that can't be bought or faked. He had already seen everything, understood it all before she did, or at the same time. It was written in the way he held his hand on her shoulder, steady, without a tremor, like a man who has already made an internal decision. In his time as a city manager, Robert had overseen zoning and investment policy. Dozens of people with beautiful business plans and hidden intentions had passed through his office. He knew how to tell one from the other from the first conversation. When Ethan Wallace had come to ask for Claire's hand 7 years ago, her father had looked at him for a long, careful time and said nothing. He didn't try to dissuade her, but he wasn't happy either. Claire had thought at the time that her dad just didn't want to let his daughter go. Now she suspected her father had simply known more than he let on. Behind him stood her mother Helen, small and beige, exactly as Claire had pictured her, looking at her daughter with that particular anxiety that mothers try to hide behind a half-smile but can never completely erase from their eyes. "Dad," Claire began, and didn't recognize her own voice. It was too quiet, too fragile on that single word. "Claire," her father repeated, and that one word contained everything. Understanding the pain he knew how to hide, and something firm like a decision made without hesitation. "Let me teach him a lesson he will never forget." She looked back to where Ethan had just been standing. He was heading for the exit, back straight and confident. The woman beside him was whispering something in his ear. He was smiling. They passed by 10 feet from Claire, and he never once looked back. He didn't sense anything, didn't notice his wife, his father-in-law, his mother-in-law. None of the people whose presence should have stirred something within him. That perhaps was more painful than anything else. "If you go up to him now," her father said, moving closer, "he'll say she's a colleague, a business meeting, that you imagined it all. He'll cause a scene in public, make you the guilty one for being hysterical, and seize the initiative. People like him are good at that. I've seen enough of them over the years. They feed on other people's reactions like fuel." Claire was silent, watching the two figures who were already dissolving into the crowd by the glass doors. "We don't need a scandal," her father continued in a level voice, as if stating the obvious. "We need a precise strike in the right place at the right time, without any unnecessary noise." "Dad," she finally managed to say, and this time her voice was steadier. "Exactly," Robert replied curtly and took her by the elbow. "So first, we find the car, go home, have dinner, and then we'll talk." Helen silently hugged her daughter, not tightly, but for a long moment. Claire didn't cry. She stood in the middle of the buzzing arrivals hall and felt something inside her, very slowly, very coldly begin to reconfigure. Not break, but reconfigure. Like a building being demolished, not with an explosion, but methodically, floor by floor, without any rush. They left through a different set of doors. Ethan and his companion were already gone. Claire didn't bother to look for them. She found her car in the parking garage, loaded her parents' bags into the trunk, and sat behind the wheel for a few moments. This corner of the garage was almost empty. Just a few parked cars and a lamppost casting a murky yellow light. "Did you know?" her mother asked from the back seat. "No," Claire said. It was the truth. There had been feelings, a sense that something was off in his tone over the past few months, in the too frequent "I'll be late" excuses, in the way he'd stopped talking about his business and at the same time stopped asking about her life. But she hadn't known. She hadn't wanted to. That was also a truth she was allowing herself to admit for the first time. "It's good that you didn't know," her father said from the passenger seat. "It means you haven't had a chance to sign anything in the heat of the moment." Claire looked at him. "What do you mean?" "We'll talk about it tomorrow." He turned and met her gaze. They both had the same gray eyes, father and daughter. Similar, not just in appearance, but in their shared habit of not breaking down out loud. "For tonight, just drive." No one said a word on the way home. Her father looked out the window at the avenue and the lights of the storefronts. He hadn't been in this city for several years, but he looked without nostalgia, with the focused attention of a man assessing a situation. Her mother quietly held her daughter's shoulder from the back seat, saying nothing, just gently squeezing her fingers on the turns. Claire drove steadily, stopping at every red light, thinking about how this day had begun so ordinarily. Coffee work, emails, a grocery list, the baked fish she'd planned for her dad. As they pulled up to her building, her phone vibrated, a message from Ethan. "Hey, having dinner with partners. Negotiations start early tomorrow. I'll call you after. Kisses." Claire read it, put the phone in her purse, got out of the car and opened the trunk. "I've got it," her father said. "Okay," she replied. Her father took both suitcases and walked toward the entrance. His back was straight, his stride was even. His face was such that no passerby would have guessed that an hour ago he had seen something that completely upended his opinion of his son-in-law. Ethan called on Wednesday evening around 8 o'clock. Claire was just clearing the table after dinner. Her mother was washing dishes, and her father was sitting in the armchair by the window with a cup of tea, reading something on his phone, when her husband's name lit up the screen. Claire froze for a second, then answered the call and walked into the hallway. She closed the door behind her quietly without a sound. She stood by the wall, leaning her back against it, and brought the phone to her ear. "Hey," Ethan said, his voice that of someone who was tired but pushing through. "How are you doing?" "Fine," she answered evenly. "How are the negotiations?" "Tough. The suppliers are dragging their feet. Can't agree on a price. Probably another day or two. I'm exhausted." He paused for a second. "You don't miss me." "I'm managing," Claire said. No warmer, no colder than usual. Exactly how she had spoken to him for the last few months, when there was almost nothing left between them that could be called a real conversation, rather than an exchange of perfunctory phrases with nothing behind them. She listened to his voice and thought about how easily he lied, without a stutter, without a pause, without the slightest tension. Like someone who has been doing it for a long time and has gotten used to it. "All right, I'll call tomorrow. Good night." "Good night," she replied, and ended the call. She stood in the dark hallway holding the phone. He hadn't asked how her day was, hadn't asked if she'd eaten or if anything had happened. He hadn't asked anything, just checked a box on his internal to-do list. Call wife tab can be closed. Claire put the phone in her pocket and returned to the kitchen. "Him?" her mother asked quietly without turning from the sink. "Him," Claire confirmed and picked up a dish towel. Her father asked nothing. He had already drawn his own conclusions, and it seemed they were final. Helen turned off the water and turned to her daughter. She looked at her for a long moment without words. Then she just hugged her briefly, tightly in that motherly way and let go. Sometimes that's the only thing a mother can do, and also the most necessary. Claire didn't cry. Not for the first time in 2 days, and not because there was no reason to. Tears required a letting go of control, and she couldn't afford that yet. Not now. She went to the bathroom, washed her face, and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. 30 years old, 7 of them next to a man whom it turned out she didn't know as well as she thought. Or maybe she did know. She just hadn't wanted to put the pieces of the puzzle together because she was afraid of what the final picture would be. Water dripped from her face. In the mirror, a woman with a direct gaze and tightly pressed lips looked back unbroken, gathering her strength. The next morning, Thursday, before Claire was about to leave for work, her father asked her to stay for a moment. They sat in the kitchen, just the two of them. Helen hadn't come out yet, and Robert spoke evenly, the way one speaks about matters that don't require excess emotion. No preambles or unnecessary words. "The apartment is in your name," he began. "It was your best decision," Claire said. "Your gift, a deed of gift. I'm the sole owner." "Is Ethan listed on any documents for the apartment title mortgage power of attorney?" "No. He's registered as a resident, but he has no ownership rights anywhere." Her father nodded curtly, like a man who has just received confirmation of an existing hypothesis. "Have you signed anything in the last year, co-signed a loan, consented to use it as collateral powers of attorney applications for a joint loan?" Claire shook her head. He brought it up a few times, talked about refinancing the business, about a joint loan, said the terms would be better with 2 incomes, that banks are more willing. Once he suggested temporarily putting the apartment up as collateral, explaining it was a technical step for 2 or 3 months and then we'd remove the lien. But I always put it off. I'd say, let's talk later. I want to understand it first. I need an independent consultation. He would get angry, but he didn't push openly. He restrained himself. "Good thing you put it off," her father said, setting his cup down on the table. This wasn't just talk about family finances. This was a plan, a consistent one. Claire looked at him. "Are you sure?" "Not yet, but I will be soon." He picked up his phone. "There's a man I've trusted for many years, Arthur Jenkins, a financial consultant. He understands debt, credit risks, and bankruptcy mechanisms better than most bank analysts I met during my years in the city administration. I'll ask him to look at the state of your husband's business through public sources, through legally accessible business information, only what's already on the surface for any attentive person." Claire said softly, "You just got here 2 days ago." "I did." He agreed without a hint of irony. "But I've known you for more than a year, and I've been watching this man for more than a year. Even from a distance, even without details. I've had time to think. Something about him bothered me from the very beginning, back when he came to meet us. I kept quiet. I didn't want to pressure you. Now I think that was a mistake." Claire said nothing. There was nothing to object to. It was pointless to argue with her own past. Arthur Jenkins arrived on Friday afternoon. Claire had specifically taken a half-day off. Sitting at work and pretending everything was fine was possible but difficult. She'd spent the morning at work on autopilot, opening spreadsheets, checking numbers, answering emails. Her colleagues didn't notice anything. She knew how to hide it. But by lunch, she realized that if she stayed there until the end of the day, she would simply break from her own silence. Arthur turned out to be a short, stocky man in his 40s in a light-colored shirt, without a tie, with a folder under his arm. He carried himself like a man who didn't need to make an impression. His results spoke for themselves. He greeted them briefly, sat down at the table, and without any preamble opened his folder. Claire sat opposite him and listened. Ethan Wallace's chain of stores consisted of 4 retail locations in different parts of the city. On paper, it was a functioning small business with turnover. In reality, it was a structure held together not by actual profit, but by constantly using new liabilities to cover old ones. 2 key suppliers had overdue invoices, for which sluggish negotiations about extensions were underway. The credit line at the bank was almost completely maxed out with only a minimal amount remaining. The warehouse was leased on favorable terms that were set to expire in 2 months, and the landlord had made it clear that he would not renew the lease under the same conditions. Furthermore, Arthur mentioned negotiations with a potential investor that Ethan had been conducting for several weeks. The investor had not yet given an answer, was requesting documentation, and was studying the business. "Isn't this just a difficult period?" Claire asked. Arthur shook his head. "A difficult period is when you're temporarily short on cash but have prospects and reserves. This is a different picture. The issue here is that there are no reserves, no financial cushion, and no plan to return to profitability. The business is surviving by constantly attracting new funds to cover previous obligations. This works right up until one of the creditors refuses to wait. Then the whole structure begins to crumble quickly and irreversibly." "Does he understand this himself?" Robert asked. "He has to," Arthur replied. "A man who has been running a business for several years sees his own numbers. The question isn't whether he knows his situation. The question is what he plans to do, and judging by what Claire described, he addressed her curtly without undue softness. He had a plan to plug some of the holes using his wife's resources through co-signing, through the apartment as collateral, or through a joint loan against her income. Most likely some combination of those." The room fell silent. Outside, the sounds of the courtyard could be heard. Children's voices, someone's music from an open window, across the way the slam of a building door, a normal warm evening oblivious to everything. Claire looked at the sheets of paper with numbers spread out before her and thought about how all this time she had mistaken his persistence for a man's inability to ask for help directly. She had mistaken pressure for awkwardness. Now these numbers explained what his words had skillfully hidden. There was no awkwardness. There was a strategy calculated, consistent, and cold-blooded. "Is the apartment under threat?" she asked. "No," her father said firmly. "You didn't sign anything. The apartment was deeded to you as a gift. It's your separate property. It is not considered marital property. In a divorce, he cannot make a claim on it without exceptional circumstances. In your case, no such circumstances exist. I'll confirm the details with a lawyer," Arthur added. "But the position on the apartment is unequivocally strong. There's nothing to fear there." "What's next?" Claire asked. Her father exchanged a brief glance with Arthur, the way people do when they have already discussed a matter beforehand. "Nothing drastic for now," Robert said. "You act at home as you normally would. You don't let on that you know about the airport. You don't sign anything using any convenient excuse, just as you have been for the past few months. You continue doing what you've been doing, and you wait." "Wait for what, exactly?" "For a situation to ripen to a critical point," Arthur answered evenly. "It will ripen on its own. It's a matter of a few weeks, no more. We don't need to invent or concoct anything. We just need to allow the real state of affairs to become visible to those who are currently turning a blind eye to it. The creditor's partners, potential investors, if they receive correct and reliable information about the risks, they will make their own decisions. No one is obligated to finance a sinking ship." "Is that legal?" Claire clarified. "Absolutely," her father said. "Without a pause, without caveats, no setups, no dirty tricks, just working with what already exists. His weaknesses are real. We are not creating them. We are simply stopping our help in hiding them." Claire fell silent. Then she looked at her father, this man who had come for a visit and in 2 days had laid out piece by piece what she hadn't dared to see for years. Not because she was blind, but because she had believed. That's what happens when you live with someone and don't want to think the worst. It's not stupidity. It's simply the price of trust that wasn't honored. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll do as you say." Her mother brought tea, set out the cups without any fuss, and sat down next to her daughter. She said nothing. Just her presence was enough, the way only those who love unconditionally and without reason can be present. It was getting dark outside. The city was living its ordinary evening. Cars, streetlights, someone's conversation in the courtyard. Nothing had changed on the outside. Inside Claire, something was slowly and definitively reconfiguring. The pain hadn't gone away. It lived somewhere under her ribs, dull and constant. But it was no longer the main thing. The main thing was now something else. Cold, focused, firm something akin to readiness. Ethan returned on Saturday evening, looking pleased with his duffel bag, and the air of a man who had spent several days in tense but successful negotiations. Claire met him in the entryway. Her parents had already left by then, as they had agreed beforehand. No extra witnesses were needed in the first few days. Let everything look normal. "Missed me," Ethan said and hugged her. "You must be tired," Claire replied. She didn't pull away. She stood straight without tension, allowed herself to be hugged, and was surprised at how easily she managed it. She used to think that when she found out about his betrayal, for sure, she wouldn't be able to look at him without trembling. It turned out she could because she was looking at him differently now, not as a husband, but as a person she needed to see right through until the time came to act. It was a cold, almost professional feeling, as if she were looking at a complex problem that needed to be solved carefully, without unnecessary movements, without mistakes. For the first week after his return, Ethan acted calm. He came home from work, talked about business in fragments, not in detail like a man used to not being listened to closely. Claire listened, noticing pauses she hadn't seen before. She noticed how he carefully avoided specifics whenever the conversation turned to money. He would say things like, "We need to sort it out. It's complicated right now. It will get better soon." It was the speech of a man buying time. Meanwhile, Arthur Jenkins worked quietly, methodically, without making any noise. The first to respond was one of the suppliers, a large wholesale warehouse with which Ethan had been cooperating for 3 years. Arthur, through his business contacts, let the commercial director know that the financial situation of Wallace's network was questionable and recommended requesting updated solvency data from his partner before extending the payment terms again. The commercial director was a practical man. He had been in the trade for a long time and had seen his share of clever schemes that fell apart at the most inconvenient moment. He didn't need much convincing. A single hint was enough. He requested current financial statements from Ethan. Ethan provided documents that looked decent on paper, but upon closer inspection showed exactly what Arthur had warned about: holes covered by deferred payments, figures that didn't add up under scrutiny. The supplier made his own decision. He demanded a partial prepayment for the next shipment instead of the usual deferred payment. For Ethan, this meant an immediate shortage of working capital at the worst possible time. The second was the warehouse landlord. Arthur didn't call him personally. He just made some inquiries through mutual acquaintances in the business community, and the information got back on its own. The landlord, a cautious man, raised the issue of renewing the lease ahead of schedule and outlined new terms, the market rate without any discounts. Ethan tried to negotiate, made promises, and tried to persuade, but without real financial proof, his words sounded unconvincing. In parallel, the potential investor with whom Ethan had been negotiating for over a month ordered an independent audit of the business. This was his own decision. A cautious man before investing money wanted to see real numbers, not a presentation. The audit showed exactly what any unbiased view would have shown: high debt cash flow gaps and dependence on deferred payments. The investor took a pause. The pause dragged on. All this didn't happen in a day or a week. Nearly 3 weeks passed after Ethan's return before the pressure became truly palpable, and it was then that he started talking about money. At first it was gentle, almost casual. They were having dinner on a Wednesday evening. Ethan was talking about some shipments. Then, as if in passing, he said, "You know, we've never had a real family capital. We should combine our efforts. It's easier together." "In what sense?" Claire asked, not looking up from her plate. "Well, in the business, you understand how it works. We're a family. It's our common cause." "I have my own job," she said calmly. "I'm a salaried employee, not an entrepreneur." Ethan nodded and didn't return to the topic that evening. But 3 days later, he brought it up again, this time more specifically. He said there was an opportunity to refinance one of the loans at a lower interest rate, but it required a second borrower with a confirmed income. "It's just a technicality," he explained. "You're not taking on any real risk, just a name on the contract." "Ethan," Claire replied just as evenly as she always did, "I will not sign any loan documents without independent legal advice. That's my rule. You know it." "What lawyer, Claire?" "This is a family matter." "That's exactly why a lawyer is needed. Family matters require special caution." He fell silent, looking at her with an expression she had learned to read over the past few weeks. Irritation veiled by an effort to remain calm. He hadn't yet realized that something in her had changed. He thought she was just being stubborn out of habit, and that next time he would try a different approach. He came back a week later with a story about the apartment. He explained for a long time patiently, almost convincingly. There was a bank, a program, an opportunity to get a large sum of money against the property as collateral for a short term 6 months, and the loan is paid off. The lien is removed. Everything's clean. He laid this out one evening as they sat in the living room speaking calmly like someone rehearsing a pre-written speech. Claire listened without interrupting, letting him finish. "The apartment will not be involved in your business risks," she said when he fell silent. "It is my personal property. It was mine before our marriage, and it will remain mine regardless of what happens with your affairs." "You talk as if I'm a stranger," he said, and a note of hurt appeared in his voice, that specific manipulative kind of hurt used as a tool. "I'm talking like a person who understands what she's signing." Ethan got up from the table and paced the room. Claire didn't watch him. She continued to read what was in her hands. She could feel his eyes on her but didn't look up. This was also part of what she had learned over these weeks, not to give him a foothold in her reaction. While this quiet, almost bloodless war was unfolding at home, Claire called her parents several times. "How are you holding up?" her mother asked one evening. "I'm holding up," Claire answered. "Is it hard?" "Yes, but not in the way I thought it would be." She paused, searching for the right words. "You know what's strangest? I don't feel like crying. I just want this to be over, for everything to fall into place." "It will," her mother said quietly. "For 7 years I convinced myself that everything was normal, that he was just tired, that business is stressful, that we were having a rough patch like everyone else. But in reality, I just didn't want to ask myself the real questions because I was afraid of the real answers." "You're not to blame for trusting," Helen said. "I know." Claire looked up. "But I won't be afraid of the answers anymore, not to a single question." Her mother didn't add anything, just agreed. During the time this story was unfolding, Claire never once showed Ethan that she knew about the airport. Not with a hint, not with a look, not with her tone. A few times she caught herself almost wanting to say something. In moments when he said something particularly self-satisfied, when he pretended everything was fine, when he was on the phone in another room, in a hushed voice thinking she couldn't hear. But each time she remembered her father's voice at the airport. "We need a precise strike, not a scandal." She held on. Vanessa Stone, in the meantime, was also sensing something, though of a completely different nature. Ethan called her less frequently, and they met in snatched moments. He promised he would sort things out soon, that everything would be resolved, that she just needed to wait a little longer. Vanessa waited. For now, she was young, attractive, and knew how to read men by one simple sign whether they had money or not. Ethan still had money, or rather the appearance of it. She noticed how he had become nervous, how he had stopped talking about their future together with that easy confidence that had attracted her in the first place. Now his voice had a note that Vanessa knew well and couldn't stand the note of a man asking for an extension. She didn't say anything to him about it, just started answering his calls a little more slowly than before, sometimes not at all. Ethan noticed and got angry, but there was nothing he could do. His trump cards were melting away one by one, and no new ones were appearing. Vanessa wasn't in a hurry to make a decision. She knew how to wait until the picture became completely clear, but inside, she already knew the answer. At the end of the 3rd week, Arthur informed Robert by phone that the investor had officially withdrawn from negotiations. Not rudely without a scene, he simply sent a letter stating that based on the analysis of the documentation, he deemed it inadvisable to enter the project at the current stage. Polite final. For Ethan, this was a blow he hadn't expected. The investor had been his main hope, real cash that could have covered the most pressing debts and bought him time to maneuver. Without that money, everything he had been building for the past few months, negotiations, promises, extensions, crumbled into a completely different picture. Claire learned about this from her father on Thursday. He called her himself and told her everything. So it's soon, she said. Soon, her father confirmed. I think a week or two, maybe the other creditors start to get nervous. That kind of information spreads quickly in the business community. Everyone wants to get what's theirs before their neighbor does. It starts a process that can't be stopped from the inside. What will he be left with? Claire asked. Debts, her father answered curtly, and an attempt to find someone to cover them. The last attempt will be you, or rather, your apartment and your income. That's why the conversation he's going to have with you soon will be the most insistent of all. Be ready. I'm ready, Claire said, and ended the call. For the next few days, Ethan walked around the apartment like a man who had something broken inside him but hadn't yet decided whether to admit it out loud. Claire watched him with the cold attentiveness she had developed over the past weeks. He had almost stopped talking about work. Before, even in bad times, he had always found words to explain the situation in a favorable light, to invent a reason why things would soon get better. Now he was silent. This silence was more eloquent than any words. On Monday, he didn't go to the office until after lunch. He sat in the kitchen with his phone, scrolling through something, typing a message, then scrolling again with that jerky, pointless movement of the fingers that a person has when they are looking for a way out and can't find one. Claire was leaving for work at 8:30. She saw him poured coffee into her thermos and buttoned her coat. Ethan looked up at her. Will you be late today? I don't know, she answered. Depends on how things go. He nodded and stared back at his phone. On Wednesday, Arthur called. He informed Claire briefly in a single text message. The bank has notified Ethan of its refusal to extend his line of credit. This wasn't just another blow. It was the very point after which the credit structure begins to seriously unravel. Without a line of credit, there was no working capital. Without working capital, there was no inventory. Without inventory, there was no revenue, which was already barely enough to cover current expenses. Claire read the message at her desk, put the phone in a drawer, and returned to the report she was checking. She finished one page, then another. Then she got up, poured herself some water, and stood by the window for a minute, looking down at the street below. Cars, pedestrians, a typical city afternoon, nothing special. That evening, for the first time, Ethan came home truly broken. He walked in silently and tossed his keys onto the console table. They slid off and fell to the floor. He didn't bother to pick them up. He walked past Claire into the living room and sank onto the sofa heavily, as if he no longer had the strength to sit up straight. He didn't take off his jacket. He just sat there, head down, staring at the floor. Claire stood in the kitchen doorway and waited in silence. She knew how to wait. At 37, Ethan Wallace was used to a certain image of himself, a man who controlled the situation, who always had a next move, a new plan, and an ironclad argument. This image gave him what he valued most, the feeling that he was one step ahead. Looking at him now, Claire saw a man who had neither a next move nor a new plan, only debts and an empty bank account. What happened? The bank, he said without looking up. They refused completely. I see, Claire said evenly. Ethan raised his head. Something in her tone bothered him. Too calm, too even unsympathetic. You see? He repeated. Is that all you can say? What do you want to hear? He stood up. He paced the room nervously quickly, like a man who needs to do something with his hands to keep from exploding. Claire, I need your help. For real right now. I'm listening. We need to use the apartment as collateral, just for 6 months. I'll take the money, pay off the most urgent debts, negotiate a new extension with the suppliers, find an investor. I just need to buy some time. No, Claire said. You didn't even think about it. I've been thinking about it for a long time. The answer is no. Ethan stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a long, searching moment, as if seeing something new in the face he had known for 7 years. So, you're just going to abandon me in this situation, like that? No, I'm just not participating in your business risks. Those are different things. You're my wife. That's exactly why I'm not a guarantor for your debts. He turned away and paced the room again. Claire stood calmly, not moving from her spot. She could feel his anger hot and almost tangible, and she didn't respond to it with anything. That was perhaps the hardest part, not to respond, not to give him a foothold. "I need money," he said finally. And in those words there was no longer any persuasion or softness, just a fact he was laying on the table a lot and fast. "You work, you have a stable income. Take out a loan." "No." "They'll give you a decent amount against your income." "No, Ethan. This is our family." He raised his voice for the first time in the entire conversation sharply, as if something had broken through. "You can't just stand in there and watch everything fall apart." "I didn't build this," Claire said quietly, "and it's not falling apart now because of the bank." He fell silent, looking at her with the expression of a man who hears something he doesn't want to understand, but knows it's too late. "What does that mean?" he asked slowly. "It means your business has had problems for more than a month," she replied just as evenly, "and you know that better than I do." Ethan didn't answer. He sat down on the sofa again. This time not heavily, but as if he had deflated, losing the anger that had given him form just a second ago. He was quiet for a moment, then said softly without his earlier aggression, almost matter-of-factly, "Fine, whatever. If it all collapses, it's not a big deal. We'll just have to live off selling your jewelry. Your daddy gave you a lifetime worth of diamonds. You're obligated to help your husband in a difficult situation. By the way, what's the code to the safe?" Claire stood and looked at him. She didn't know what she had expected to hear, but not this. Not such a simple, crude formulation of what she had been to him all these years. Not a partner, not a loved one, an insurance policy, a backup plan, a line item in the budget in case of failure. She had thought it would hurt that this phrase would break something, or conversely unleash a wave of emotion that would be hard to contain. But there was no pain. No wave. There was only that strange feeling of complete clarity that comes when the last question finally gets its last answer. For 7 years she had convinced herself that she was seeing a man who was just tired, stressed, holding on with all his might. Now she was seeing him for real. He wasn't even trying to hide it because he didn't see the need. Something inside her, the last thing that was still holding on from her old life, sank to the bottom and stayed there. Without pain, without bitterness. "Okay," she said. "I heard you." She went back to the kitchen, closed the door behind her, and stood by the sink for a few minutes looking out the window. It was getting dark. The lamp in the courtyard lit up yellow and slightly flickering. An old woman was sitting on a bench under it with a dog on a leash. The dog was looking off to the side, the most ordinary scene. Claire took out her phone and texted her father. "It's time." The reply came a minute later. "Understood. With Arthur tomorrow." That night, she barely slept, not from anxiety, but from a strange, almost physical clarity that comes after a final decision has been made. Her thoughts were sharp, short, specific. What needs to be done? In what order? How exactly? The next day, Thursday, she met Arthur in a small cafe near her office. She told him about the previous night's conversation calmly without extra details, only what was important. When she got to the phrase about living off you, "We'll sell your jewelry," Arthur said. Nothing, just raised his eyebrows for a second, like a man who has received confirmation of what he already knew. Arthur spoke to the point. His situation now is this. The bank has revoked his line of credit. The supplier is demanding prepayment, which he doesn't have. The landlord has raised the rent. He either pays or finds a new warehouse, which takes time and money he also doesn't have. The investor is gone. By my estimate, he has 2 to 3 weeks at most before real problems with creditors begin. After that, a process will start that can't be stopped without external financing, which won't be coming, Claire said. Right, Arthur confirmed. Unless someone comes in and voluntarily plugs the holes, but he has no one left like that. Business partners see the situation and don't want to risk it. No one will give him new credit without collateral. He's at a dead end. Claire looked out the cafe window at the street evenly, without triumph, without malice, just looked. Then she asked, I need a family law attorney, a good one. I have a contact, Arthur said. She can see you tomorrow at 11 a.m., if that works for you. It works. The lawyer turned out to be a woman in her 40s, brisk, precise speaking in short sentences without any fluff. She received Claire in a small office lined with shelves of folders, listened attentively without once interrupting, asked a few clarifying questions sharp professional without any excess, and examined the documents for the apartment, the deed of gift, the property record. After 20 minutes, she gave her conclusion, which Claire already roughly knew but wanted to hear officially. The apartment is your separate property acquired before the marriage by gift. It is not part of the marital assets and is not subject to division in a divorce. There are no risks provided that no papers involving your husband were signed. Not one, Claire confirmed. The lawyer nodded and briefly explained the procedure. A petition for dissolution of marriage notice of termination of joint cohabitation, and if necessary, a motion to determine the use of the residence. It was all a standard procedure without complications or pitfalls. Claire listened, took notes in a notebook, and thought about how strange these words sounded. Dissolution of marriage, division of marital assets in relation to 7 years that had once seemed real, or at least had seemed real at one time. "Call when you're ready," the lawyer said as she was leaving. "We can prepare the documents in 2 days." On Friday evening, Ethan brought up the conversation again, this time without anger, without pressure. He spoke quietly, almost pleadingly. He said he had found another option. A small private loan. All it needed was a cosigner. Not a bank, not collateral, just a signature. "No," Claire said. "Claire, I'm asking you. No." He was silent for a long time, then got up and went into the other room. Half an hour later, Claire heard him talking to someone on the phone in a low, tense voice, then silence. In those days, Vanessa didn't pick up the phone on the first ring. Sometimes she didn't call back at all. Ethan noticed, but there was no one to talk to about it, and no point. His last conversation with her had been brief. She said she was tired of waiting, that this wasn't right, that she needed certainty. Ethan promised certainty once again, using the same words that had ceased to mean anything even to himself. Vanessa replied, "Okay," in the voice of someone who says the word already knowing that nothing will be okay, and she didn't call again. Saturday passed in silence. Ethan spent the whole day at home, pacing the apartment, looking at his phone, eating without appetite. He went out onto the balcony twice and stood there looking down at the courtyard with the empty expression of a man who has run out of versions of what is happening. Claire worked on her laptop in the bedroom, coming out only to the kitchen. They barely spoke. This silence was different, not the familiar kind that followed long work weeks, but the special kind that falls when both people already know it's over, but neither has said it out loud yet. Claire thought about how in a few days this apartment would be hers alone again. She would come home, and it would be quiet in a different way than it was now. Not the silence of anticipation and tension, but the silence of a space that belongs to you. She didn't look any further ahead than that. For now, it was enough just to get to the end of what had started at the airport 5 weeks ago. On Monday evening, Claire called the lawyer and asked her to prepare the documents. Her voice was steady without a tremor, without a pause, like someone who has long since made a decision and is now simply carrying out what follows from it. The lawyer replied briefly, "Everything will be ready by 10 a.m. tomorrow." Claire thanked her, hung up, and sat for a while in the silence of the bedroom, looking at the closed door. Beyond the door was the living room. Ethan was sitting there. She could hear him flipping through channels, stopping on something, then flipping again. Not watching, just filling the silence with sound. She had learned to notice that too. On Tuesday morning, she got up earlier than usual, made coffee, and drank it standing by the window, looking at the waking courtyard. Ethan was still asleep. She got dressed, took her bag, and left quietly, just as she did every morning. Nothing special. At 10 a.m., she picked up the documents from the lawyer, a copy of the petition for dissolution of marriage, a certificate of title for the apartment, a notarized copy of the deed of gift. Everything was neatly arranged in a folder, signed and prepared. The lawyer filed the original petition with the court that same day as they had agreed. Claire held the folder in her hands and looked at the stack of papers, thinking about how 7 years of marriage could fit into such a set of standard documents that everything that had been alive and real, or had seemed alive and real, ultimately boiled down to dates, signatures, and official seals. It wasn't bitter. It was just the truth, which she had finally allowed herself to see completely. After that, Claire went to her parents who had flown in during the night and were staying at a hotel to help their daughter through the final ordeal. Robert opened the door to the hotel room immediately, as if he had been waiting right behind it. Her mother was sitting by the window with a cup of tea and looked up with an attentive, anxious, loving gaze. Claire came in, took off her coat, and sat on the edge of an armchair. The room smelled of coffee and fresh newspapers. Her father always bought newspapers. It was an old habit of his from his working days to start the day with reading, not with a phone screen. Claire thought that some things about a person never change, and that was a good thing. They hugged. "Tonight," she said. Her father nodded. "I'll be nearby. Just nearby, not interfering unless I'm needed." "You won't be needed," Claire said. "I can handle this myself." "I know," he answered. "That's why I said just nearby." Her mother stood up, walked over to her daughter, and hugged her the way you hug someone before something important tightly, but without excessive ceremony. Claire held on for a second and then let go. "How are you?" Helen asked quietly. "Ready," Claire replied. And it was the truth. She spent the second half of the day at work, calmly, productively, without extraneous thoughts. She closed out 3 reports that had been pending since last week, answered emails, had tea with a colleague at 3 o'clock, and made small talk about nothing. No one noticed anything. She knew how to hide it. That skill had served her well in recent weeks. At 6 p.m., she left the office and drove home. On the way, she picked up her father. They drove in silence. Robert looked out the window and said nothing. Claire drove steadily and thought about what she was going to say. The words were simple, no speech, just what was necessary. Ethan was home standing in the kitchen with his phone when she walked in. He looked up, noticed her father behind her, and something in his face changed instantly. Not fear, no. More like the weariness of an experienced person who understands that if his father-in-law shows up unannounced, it's not for no reason. "Robert," he said evenly, "I didn't know you were in town." "I've been in town for a while," her father replied, just as evenly, and walked into the living room. He sat in the armchair by the window calmly, like a man who has come on business and is in no hurry. Claire remained standing in front of Ethan. "We need to talk." "I'm listening," he said, but his voice had already lost its usual confidence. It was a little strained. "I know about the airport," Claire said. "I was there 5 weeks ago. I saw you and the woman you flew in with." Ethan didn't answer right away. He was silent for a second with the expression of a man whose mind is rapidly cycling through options. Deny, explain, attack, and response. He chose the first. "That was a colleague, a business trip. We were on the same flight." "You kissed her on the lips in the arrivals hall," Claire said. "You carried her bag, and you left with her in a taxi." Silence. "My parents were standing next to me at that moment," Claire added. "Without anger, without bitterness, just as a fact. They saw the same thing I did, so you can drop the business trip story." Ethan slowly put his phone down on the table and looked at her. No longer attempting to explain, he just looked. "I know about Vanessa Stone," she continued. "She works as a salesperson in one of your stores. It's been going on for more than a month." Silence. "I also know about your business," she said. "About the creditors, the bank, and the investor who walked away. I know the real situation you're in and what you've wanted from me all these months. The apartment my jewelry signature's co-signing." "Claire," he began. "I'm not finished," she interrupted calmly. "I filed a petition for dissolution of marriage this morning. The papers have been accepted. The apartment is my separate property acquired by gift before the marriage. It is not subject to division. You know that. I'm asking you to vacate it within the hour." Ethan looked up at her. There was no confusion in his eyes. There was anger, quick and cold, the kind that comes when a plan has finally and completely collapsed. "You planned all this," he said. "With your daddy." "I protected myself," Claire replied. "Those are different things. You think I don't understand what's been happening these last few weeks." His voice grew harsher. "The suppliers, the landlord, the investor, none of that was a coincidence. Your daddy used his old connections." "Prove it," her father said from the armchair quietly without a challenge. "Just an invitation." Ethan turned to him, looked at him for a long moment, then turned away. Because there was nothing to prove. The creditors had made their own decisions. The investor had conducted his own audit. The landlord had recalculated his risks. No one had done anything illegal. People had simply stopped turning a blind eye to the real state of affairs. "Did you hear me?" Claire repeated. "If you don't leave voluntarily, I will settle the matter through the court. As the owner of the property, I have that right." Ethan was silent. Then he picked up the keys from the kitchen table and left. He slammed the door. Not too hard, but hard enough. Claire stood in the middle of the kitchen, listening to his footsteps fade down the stairs. Then silence. Her father came out of the living room and stood beside her. He didn't hug her, didn't say anything. He just stood there. It was enough. An hour later, Ethan returned for his things. He packed silently, quickly, into a large sports duffel bag. He moved between rooms, grabbing clothes, some papers from his desk drawer, chargers, a razor from the bathroom. Claire sat in the living room reading or pretending to read. Her father was still in the armchair, with the imperturbable look of a man in no hurry. No one interfered, no one commented. They just waited. Two people who had long ago learned not to interfere where a person must act for themselves. Claire heard him opening and closing closet doors, the click of a drawer lock, the rustle of a bag. Ordinary household sounds that she had heard for 7 years, and which now meant something entirely different. An end is never beautiful. It just is. When Ethan was leaving, he stopped in the doorway for a second and looked at Claire. "You think you've won," he said. "I think I've saved what's mine," she replied. "This isn't a victory. It's just the outcome." He left. The door closed quietly. Claire put down the book she had been holding without reading and sat in silence for a long time. Her father didn't rush her. Her mother, who had arrived a little later and quietly let herself in with the key Claire had given her, put the kettle on and sat down next to her. The three of them drank tea. Outside, it was getting dark that special evening hour, when the city transitions from day to night and for a few minutes stands in a golden silence that is hard to describe, but everyone knows. No one talked about anything serious. Her father asked if there was any decent bread in the house. Her mother went to check the fridge. Claire looked out the window and thought about how strangely life is arranged. The most important things end just like this, with tea, silence, and a question about bread. No fanfares, no final speeches. You just keep living, only a little differently, a little more honestly and freely. Her mother found the bread. They ate, then sat for a long time talking about nothing in particular, the city, the weather, how Claire should come visit them in the summer. Ordinary words, the most necessary ones. In the following days, everything unfolded as Arthur had predicted. Ethan's creditors, seeing that there would be no external source of funding, began to act. One demanded early repayment of part of the debt. Another blocked the next shipment until the overdue balance was paid. 2 of the 4 stores shut down. They ran out of inventory, and there was no new stock. The warehouse landlord sent an invoice at the new rate which Ethan couldn't pay. At the end of the month, he vacated the warehouse, moving the remaining goods in a rented van and scattering them somewhere, trying to sell off whatever he could at any price. Vanessa quit. The last store closed 2 weeks later. By then, Vanessa had stopped answering his calls altogether. She changed her profile picture in her messaging app. In the new one, there was an unfamiliar man, large and well-dressed. Claire, and without any extra explanations, she never explained anything. Why bother when the outcome is already clear? Ethan texted Claire several times, at first with attempts to negotiate, then with reproaches, then he fell silent. Claire replied briefly, and only to what concerned the divorce, the hearing date, the list of documents, confirmation of receiving notices, nothing extra. The divorce went through without a scandal. The judge asked the standard questions. Both stated that reconciliation was impossible. The apartment was not presented for division. There were no grounds. The marital property accumulated over 7 years turned out to be little. The furniture which stayed with Claire and the car which went to Ethan. That was all. Leaving the courthouse, Claire paused on the steps. Her father and mother stood nearby, a little distance away, giving her her own space. The autumn sun was shining not hot, not warm, but that special kind of light that is bright but doesn't warm, and because of that, seems honest. Claire lifted her face to it for a second, felt its light almost imperceptible warmth, and thought that perhaps this was what the beginning of something new felt like, not a celebration and not relief, just the first day that belonged only to her again. Then she turned to her parents. "It's done," she said. "It's done." Her mother confirmed and took her hand. Her father said nothing. He just walked beside her calmly, evenly, as he always had. Like that day at the airport, when he put his hand on her shoulder and said, "Let me teach him a lesson." He wasn't seeking revenge then. He was simply removing a traitor's ability to live off someone else's trust. It wasn't punishment, it was protection. A small difference at first glance, but it was everything. Claire walked down the courthouse steps between her father and mother, not thinking about the past. She was thinking about what tonight would be like quiet her own, without someone else's silence and someone else's lies. Just an evening, just silence, just her own life, which now, once again, belonged only to her.